Hey everyone, welcome to North Royalton Republican Club. Our speaker for today is going to be David Pristash. He's on the blog at Centennial 2012. That's where I met him and looked at some of his work on climate change along many different articles. And he has a number of credentials, and a lot of that has to do with military, but he does have education in technology marketing and economics. He's been studying this for a long time. I know you had some papers you wrote long back on climate change, so it's something you've been looking into. But besides that, he's got quite a military career. Former captain, U.S. Army. He's at counterinsurgency. He studied with the 5th Special Forces, weapons and demolitions with the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center of School, and the military leadership at Fort Benning's for boys, and unconventional warfare, University of South Vietnam, which is something I'd like him to explain a little bit above. But let's welcome David Pristash to our meeting.
Hi, thank you. Honored to be here and to give a little talk on climate change. I was going to add a little bit to that introduction because this is a very technical, complicated subject, and that's what makes it hard to communicate. And I just want to give some of my credentials that allow me to talk about it. I was born in 1941. When I was a junior in high school, in 1958, I placed #1 in the Greater Cleveland area in physics, the test they used to give. In the next year, 1959, I won the Cleveland Science Fair by building a robot, long before anybody else. Now, in OU, I majored in economics, and I had a 3.9 GPA in economics. I took every course they had. Case, I got another 3.9 that was marketing, it didn't really count. I have 8 issued patents. I developed the treatment for jaundice that's in use today. And if you have a flat screen TV, it uses the technology that I developed. Being in the Army is kind of important. I went to OCS, I got my commission, second lieutenant, and they recruited me into the Green Berets. And we were, like to say, the best of the best, a lot better than SEALs. And what we were trained to do, which is important to this subject, is in the early 60s, we were trained to drop in behind the Iron Curtain and convert the communists to capitalists. In other words, bring down their government. Now, we would have had to been at war, and we never really did it, but that was our training, to go in and do that. So what we had to do is we had to study communism, because we had to know how to defeat it. So my background in economics was very good for that mission, that type of mission. But instead of going there, I went to Vietnam. And the mission there was a little different. I was wounded there in 1967 and sent back to the States, spent a little more time in the military, and then went to work for General Electric, designing and building electric cars. Now, in the early 90s, I detected that there was a movement going on in the country to convert us to communism. Now, I didn't realize how bad it was initially because it was very subtle, but I could see that the things that were being done to change our system of government. There was no doubt in my mind. I didn't think it got into the sciences. I was very big in science from my initial school in high school. I was very big into the space program. I would have tried to get in, but I had bad eyes, and that was never going to happen. So right after 9/11, I was working on miniature fuel cell that I was helping to develop for the Department of Defense. And at that time, Al Gore's book came out and all this stuff came about climate change, right in about that period of time. And then we had a conference here at CASE, I think it was in 2005. And it was a bunch of people from the government on energy and why they couldn't do what they thought needed to be done. And it triggered something in me about the government. Well, also during that period of time, I decided to go back and study why we were in Vietnam and read a lot of books on that. And we shouldn't have been there. We lost a lot of people. I won't talk more about that. But the movement to change the form of government seemed to me to be related to climate change. And so that's where I started my work on the subject. So I'll go into it, but I just wanted you to know that this is not, I've been doing this for 12 years. So I'm going to go over energy inputs and data manipulation out of NASA and NOAA, and we'll see how much farther we can get into it. Now, the first thing that everybody forgets is the Earth's orbit is not a circle. In January, it's the closest to the sun, and in the summer, it's the farthest away, which seems counterproductive or counterintuitive. And it's about 5 million miles, a little less than 5 million miles different. But what we find is in the winter, in the summer, the axis is pointed toward the sun. So the northern hemisphere gets a lot more energy than it would otherwise. And when it's the closest, it's pointed away. So this causes a change in the amount of energy coming from the sun, which is very important. Now, I won't go through the math, but there's Stefan Boltzmann law that allows you to determine the energy input to what the temperature would be in an object. And what it says, if you run the numbers, there's no playing with the numbers, these are the temperatures that the planet would be based on the variances. And it's from a minus 20 C, 18.8 C, and 16.7 C because of variations. Today, we're about 14.85 C. So that number is dependent on this number, which is called the Blackbody number. Now, because of what I showed you with the orbit, what you see is the energy input from the sun is highest in January and lowest in July, which is very important. What they do in science is they just take an average and they say, well, it's pretty close to 18 degrees C. So we'll just use that number. But in reality, it's this curve still. We'll skip that. Then what we have is the radiation's coming in from the sun. It's in a surplus mode between the equator and 37 degrees north and south. And then it's in a deficit from there to the pole, which means there's a big heat flow transfer both ways. That gives us these weather patterns, which is actually what this whole thing is about. It's all about weather. Another thing that's showing the sunlight coming in. Now, the moon is the same distance from the sun as we are for all practical purposes. The surface temperature runs from 110 to minus 150. What keeps us from that temperature is the atmosphere and the water in the atmosphere. That's just a little more, we'll skip that. The orbital changes, the planet goes through a lot of orbital changes. They're called the Milankovitch Variations, and that gives us here stages of glaciation. This is from 100,000 years ago to now. And ice ages and warm periods is common in history, geological history. There's also variations in the sun's output. So that's not a constant either. And these are all documented items. Now, this graph is important. This is historical, from 590 million years ago. This line represents the CO2 level in the atmosphere. And you can see it was around 7,000 part per million 500 million years ago. The temperature of the planet was, about 22 degrees C, a little less. But this is the temperature, best that they can determine, and this is the CO2. And you can see there really is no correlation between the two. Here they're both down. Here CO2's up, but temperature's up a little bit. Here it's up, temperature's down. Over here it's down when it's over here. It's been up here and it's coming down, and CO2 has been coming down. But in any case, if you try to run a correlation between these two values, you just don't get anything. This is a little more closer to current time. We're in the modern warm time here. We had a little ice age around 1650, a medieval warm period. This is when they discovered Greenland and called it green. Another little cold period, a Roman warm period, and so forth and so on. This little bit over here is what we've been measuring. But this is all determined by glaciers and geology, and that's what it actually was. A little more detail, we'll skip through this, we don't have a lot of time. 5 major temperature swings up and down in the past 8,000 years. Temperature changes do not appear to move up or down from CO2 levels. With the exception of the present increase in CO2, all the rest of the changes could not have been caused by man. Therefore, we need to look at what does happen. Now, this is one of the things that shows that things did warm up. I didn't get too many laughs. Those are women's panties. Now, this is the information from NASA and NOAA. This is the CO2. They started measuring it in 1958. And it's going up, you can see very gradually, but as a little bit of a curve. So it's accelerating. This is the temperature as determined by NOAA and NASA. I did run this as a monthly moving average because the numbers jumped around so much. So this smooths it out. Now, what you saw there is there was a cold period, a warm period, a cold period, and now another warm period. That's what the numbers show. Now, these are the projections. Now right here, this line is what the IPCC says is the temperature is going to happen. That's where it's going to go. This is the log curve that shows the trend of the CO2 increases. And we'll get a little more in that. But you can see is the temperatures that they're showing in relationship to the CO2 don't really match. There's something else going on here. All right, now this is a really important one. What I did, as I said, I want to show CO2 and temperature on a same basis. So we're not looking at CO2 at 400 part per million and temperature at 14 degrees C. I want to put them on an equal basis. So what I did is I took, for 1958, that was the base. And each month, I did the percent increase that month was from the base for both temperature and CO2. So now they're on an equal basis. They're not on different scales. So this is the CO2 going up, and it's gone up 30%, 130% from the base, but the temperature increase you can't even measure. Very small percentage. Now, the reason that is they're not using the right units. If we're using Fahrenheit or centigrade, you can't use that in engineering or science. You have to use Kelvin, which is absolute zero. That's no temperature, 273 degrees below zero, or 450 something if you're using Fahrenheit. So if you want to know what the amount of energy that was increased that raised the temperature, you have to go from Kelvin, because that measures the amount of heat. Temperature is a relative number the way we look at it. This is the actual number. So what I did next is I changed the scale. All right? So temperature, I changed it from matching the changes on this side. This scale is the same, but now I only went to 5% all the way to the top instead of the 50%, 150%. So we can see a little bit of movement here in the temperature. But it's hard to determine the change in temperature when you're looking at it in the right units. So that proves, that chart there proves there's no relationship or a very minimal relationship between CO2 and temperature. So this is cause and effect. The two numbers move together in some cases, but one doesn't cause the other. It's a third factor that causes the temperature. And the example is, when the ground is white, it's cold outside. It's white because it's cold and there's snow on the ground. But white doesn't cause cold. It's the temperature change. So there's correlation between that, but there is no cause and effect. All right, now, this is another one that's important. Energy comes from the sun. And energy comes in, this is the curve for the energy coming from the sun, and the energy goes back out, and this is the energy going back out. So there's actually two curves, in and out. This is the total. Now, this is water, right here. These are the bands, the frequency bands that water absorbs energy. And you can see that the water will absorb in the incoming radiation. It will absorb some. And it also will pick up some of here and some over here. There's a little bit of a hole right there. Now, CO2, which everybody's saying is causing the planet to heat up. Well, number one, it doesn't pick up any of the incoming. There's a little bit here and a little bit here is basically nothing. And there's a little bit over here too. And these show that there's a very minor effect from CO2. This right here and this right here, these can exchange heat right there. This one can't really, this one can over here. So the heat can go from the carbon into the water here and a little bit over here. And I created this graph, and what you have are water molecules and CO2 molecules split in the atmosphere, and the CO2 will pick up some of the outgoing and transfer it to some of the water vapor that's in the atmosphere. That's the actual process that's going on here. It isn't the temperature of the CO2, it's that it absorbs some of the outcoming and will transfer a small amount of it to the water. But the water is already saturated because it picks it up from the sun. So this whole effect is pretty much nothing. Now, this is interesting. If you plot temperatures, these are the months of the year, and these are the published values, 14.5 C, 0.6 C on this chart. That's what it looks, pretty much a straight line. But we do know that there's less energy coming in the summer. This curve goes down. So if this number is staying almost constant and the temperature, the incoming radiation is lower in the summer, that means that these numbers aren't right. This curve should be the same shape as this curve. And the difference is 4 degrees. 4 degrees C is made up number in the summertime. Because the temperature should be, the global temperature should be lower in the summer. But they can't do that because if they showed that, it would confuse people. How can the global temperature be colder in the summer? Well, it is, but it depends on where you're going to measure it. If you're measuring in the northern hemisphere where there's a lot of land, or if you're in the southern hemisphere and there's a lot of water. So that right there proves that they're faking the data. Here's another proof. I plotted the energy coming in from the sun with 2 different albedo values. The one in the middle is what it is, and just to see what it would do, I changed it from 30% to 20 and from 30% to 40. So that's these numbers. Well, the higher the number, the less energy that's coming in. This is the actual energy movement that they're showing. If they show the temperature goes from X to Y, well, the difference is the change in energy. So you calculate what the energy in the atmosphere is, and you plot it monthly, and you get this crazy graph. This graph should look like this graph. The numbers are going to be different, but the energy coming in has to equal the energy going out. But you can't get these wild swings. So again, that proves that the method they're using to determine the global temperature is wrong. And, well, it gets pretty complicated. If that wasn't. Now, all right. I've got this video, if I can get it to play. Patrick Moore is one of the founders of Greenpeace.
I was born and raised here on this floating village on the northwest coast of Vancouver Island. Was sent to boarding school in Vancouver, where I, as an ecologist...
This is pretty important, so I'd really like you to watch this.
The threat of all of nuclear war and the emerging consciousness of the environment, and joined a small group of people to voyage to Alaska to stop hydrogen bomb testing, which we and many other people, we as the kind of spearhead, did. That was the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. Here, much later, I'm driving a rubber boat into the first encounter with the Soviet factory whaling fleet. Perhaps Dr. Mann doesn't realize that 30,000 whales were still being killed in the early 1970s. It had really nothing to do with fossil fuels replacing them. And we put ourselves in front of the harpoons and got on TV around the world to protect the fleeing. 15 whales, and Greenpeace was made famous as a result of this. 1 million 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 1 I left Greenpeace for a number of very good reasons in 1986 after 15 years in the leadership. This has been shown already. Mine's a little more up to date. It shows that it's up above 400 there. And there's no doubt in my mind that human CO2 emissions are the primary cause of this. Ocean warming may have caused a teeny bit of it. Now you're shown graphs like this with y-axes of only 1.4 degrees in order to make it look like there's been this huge increase in global temperature, when in fact if you put it on a scale that's like between -10 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, you can hardly notice the 1 degree rise in temperature. This has not been a very significant change in global temperature. The last 300 years is when it started, at the peak of, or the depths of the Little Ice Age. We certainly had nothing to do with the fact that it started warming again 300 years ago after many hundred years of cooling coming out of the medieval warm period into the Little Ice Age. Let's go back 570 million years.
I've showed you some of this, but
what I'm showing you here is temperature and CO2 to the best of our knowledge going back that far. You can see that they are almost never in sync. Sometimes they are completely out of sync, like 146 million years ago there. CO2 goes up, temperature comes down at the same time, then CO2 starts going down and temperature goes up. There was an ice age there 290 million years ago or so when CO2 was very high, and then there was another period where they came in sync, but then when CO2 continued to remain low at that big dip there in the middle, temperatures skyrocketed up to a pretty well a modern history high in terms of the 500 years since modern life emerged in the Cambrian explosion. So it's ironic to note that this last period that we're in now, the Pleistocene Ice Age and the Eocene Interglacial Period, are the coldest since 270 million years. That's when the last ice age occurred. That's why all that ice is on Antarctica and the Arctic, because this is an ice age. And periodically, quite frequently in fact, during the last 2.5 million years, it has descended down to south of the US-Canada border on many occasions. A long-term history of CO2 and temperature, and this concludes the fact that CO2 is not the primary control knob of global temperature. There's actually far higher correlation between shark attacks and ice cream consumption. And that's because correlation is not necessarily causation. Causation requires correlation, but very often strong correlations are the result of a third common factor, in this case, temperature. Because when people go swimming in the summer, they come back to the beach and eat ice cream. And that's when they get attacked by sharks. So just remember, anytime anybody shows you a correlation inferring that it's a causation, do not accept it at face value. Here's a correlation that's true. Life expectancy and CO2 emissions. The reason life expectancy, a large part of it, is because of our use of fossil fuels. They are 83% of our energy supply in the world today, and they play a huge role in our longevity, our wealth, and our personal freedom. This is the last 65 million years since the dinosaur extinction. The temperature skyrocketed to what is known as the Eocene thermal maximum. This is from a Greenland ice core. I'll show you ice cores from Antarctica later, which go back much further. You can see that we are basically at the tail end of a 50 million year cooling period on this Earth. Just 3 million years ago, the Arctic islands of my country, Canada, were covered in forests with giant camels roaming in them. There was nothing wrong with that climate. It was perfectly acceptable for life on Earth. As a matter of fact, when people say, well, we couldn't live back there when it was so warm because there weren't any people yet then, I think our ancestors came through that, or we might not be sitting in the auditorium tonight. Our ancestors came through more changes over the last 500 million years than you can throw a stick at. Absolutely nothing compared to anything variable that's happening today. As a matter of fact, not one single factor of weather or climate happening today is anywhere out of line with the last 10,000 years. Nothing. And I'd like someone to name me one. CO2 is out of line, but it's not weather or climate. There's CO2 going up at the end there. We did that. Notice the temperature isn't following it. But what I'm looking at here is the 100,000 year cycles of glaciation and interglacial periods. The high points are the interglacial periods. The one on the right is the one we're in now. Note that it is colder than the 3 previous interglacial periods. The Pleistocene is still cooling. Note that they are very much in sync with CO2, the temperature curve. This was the fundamental fraud in Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth. He said, CO2 is causing the change in temperature. These are the Milankovitch cycles, in sync with the 100,000-year Milankovitch cycle, which is the changes in the Earth's orbit, in the shape of it. How would changes in the shape of the Earth's orbit affect CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere? No, they would affect temperature. And temperature would affect the ocean's temperature, and the ocean's temperature determines how much CO2 can be dissolved in it. So when it warms, CO2 comes out, and when it cools, CO2 breathes into the ocean. The ocean has 45 times as much CO2 in it as the atmosphere does. And here is a stretching out the last 50,000 years. You can see that CO2 follows temperature. As we come out of the glaciation from 20,000 years ago, well, 18,000 years is where the low point was there, CO2 fell to 180 parts per million. I'll tell you more about that later. Here is the last sea. It's divided into 2 parts. The Holocene climate optimum, where it was much warmer, 2 degrees Celsius or so. What they say is going to kill us all if we allow it to go up 2 degrees from what it is now. And then it goes into the Neo Glacial Period. This means the new glacial period. Note that CO2, the red line, was rising while temperature was falling. Another very convincing indication that CO2 is not the control knob of global climate. And then we see, this is why they call it the Neo Glacial Period. These are charts showing the advance of glaciers. So when it was warmer in the Holocene climate optimum, very little glacial activity. It was a warm enough period to cause the glaciers to retreat, as they had been for the last 10,000 years since the peak of the glaciation. But the Neoglacial period, the colder period we're in now, we see glaciers advancing, and the little ice age is shown as the tallest chart there. That was the coldest it's been for 10,000 years. It was only 300 years ago. The Thames River last froze over in 1814. And isn't it a bit odd that the world record temperatures, the warmest recorded was in 1913, and the coldest recorded was in 2010? These are global records. How could that happen if there was such a massive warming going on in the world? And this is what it looked like 21,000 years ago. At the peak of the last glaciation, Montreal, where it is now, was under 3.3 kilometers of ice. This is natural climate change. It occurred by itself. We don't know why. And we don't know why we plunged from the Eocene thermal maximum 50 million years ago into the present Pleistocene ice age. No idea. It wasn't CO2, that's for sure, because for the first 100 million years of the decline in CO2, temperature was rising into the 50 million year Eocene maximum. You've seen this chart. Where it levels off at the top there is where the big glaciers were all melted. And that's basically where the warm part of the Holocene occurred. But it shows it slightly rising from then on for 7,000 years. How could this happen if the sea was rising steadily for 7,000 years, even slowly? This is one of thousands of islands at the equator in Indonesia that have been undercut by the sea's erosion in a calm equatorial climate. Here is the sea level rise in Florida. There is no acceleration. This is expected because we're in a modern warm period. Here is showing that even the IPC rejects the idea that extreme weather events are being caused by either natural or human-caused climate change. First they said it was global warming, then it stopped warming so much, then they said it was climate change, then if you said, well, last winter was really cold, they said that wasn't climate, that's just weather. Now what do they talk about? You saw the presentation. It's all about extreme weather events. It's changed the goalpost twice since we started with this fantasy. CO2 is the most important food for all life on Earth. That's where the carbon in carbon-based life comes from. Here's where the carbon is. The atmosphere has 850 billion tons, but there's 100 billion tons in carbonaceous rocks, limestone, marble, and chalk. All that carbon came from the atmosphere via the ocean by calcifying marine organisms such as this one that lived when CO2 was at 2,000 parts per million, not just 400 like it is now. And here's an example of many of the calcifying marine organisms that caused that 100 million billion tons of carbon to be drawn out of the annual cycle and put into the bottom of the sea, so that here you see CO2 has been declining steadily for at least 600 million years, while temperature has basically got no pattern. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. CO2 goes one way, down. And if CO2 had continued to go down at the level it was in the absence of human CO2 emissions, this is what would have happened. It was only 30 parts per million above the death of plants at the height of the last glaciation when it fell to 180 ppm. At 150, they died. We have inadvertently reversed the decline in carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere, so it is a salvation, not something to be demonized. Here's what CO2 does when you increase it with trees. Makes them grow twice as fast at double the level. Every commercial greenhouse grower in the world pumps CO2 into their greenhouses to make them produce more food. And here, the top science body in Australia, CSIRO, shows us the greening of the Earth by CO2, and then NASA shows us the same thing. They know it too. And here is the world's energy supply. The greens are against coal, oil, gas, nuclear, and hydroelectric, and only in favor of 1.3% of the world's energy supply. It reminds me of when they said in Vietnam, you have to destroy the village to save it. We have to destroy human civilization to save it, apparently. And that's what would happen if you cut out all those things which are basically 98% of the world's energy. Here's the coal plants being built or planned in the world. China is continuing to build them apace. The fact is, fossil fuels are 100% organic, as in the scientific definition of organic. Organic chemistry is the chemistry of carbon. Organic used in food is a marketing term, nothing to do with science. Produced with solar energy, 100%, they are a product of life, fossil fuels. They are not some evil demon sent here from hell. They produce the two most important foods for life when they're burnt, CO2 and water, and they are the largest storage battery of energy on this planet. So I say, celebrate CO2. It is the most life-giving substance, along with water, on this planet, and it's doing the world a lot of good. If it ever does warm up because of CO2, it would be a good thing, but it doesn't look like it's having much effect there. And nobody mentioned water vapor as by far the most important greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. It's at least 90% of the greenhouse effect. First, because it's 25 to 100 times the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, 1 to 4% compared to 0.04% for CO2. And two, because it absorbs a much wider range of infrared radiation across the spectrum than CO2 does. And water vapor may actually just pretty well diminish the effect of CO2 because it absorbs in the same bands. CO2, there is no way that it is any more than a few percent of the greenhouse effect on this Earth. And that, I don't know how anybody could argue with that, because it is 25 to 100 times as present in the atmosphere. And that's why I think we should celebrate CO2. And just remember, the bubbles in your beer and champagne are CO2. Thank you very much.
Variations IPCC is one that there will be severe, pervasive.
That's pretty good.
Now, he has the creds, being the start of Greenpeace. Now, what happened is he didn't mention why he left Greenpeace, but it was in the late 80s, and
1987. That was going to be my question. He said he left it in 1987, but he didn't say why after 15
right,
years.
okay, I'm going to tell you why. He tells, I didn't want to play the whole thing, but he does explain it. What happened then, a couple of things were happening then. That was, that period through the 1990 is when the Soviet Union was collapsing. Okay, and the USSR collapsed and it went away. Well, that decimated the communist movement worldwide. That was their baby. The Democratic Party was heavily involved in working with the Democrats. Ted Kennedy actually contacted Russia and said that he was working to stop Reagan with what he was doing. So there was a lot of bad stuff going on. Well, what happened is a group of them decided to take over the environmental movement, and they targeted Greenpeace. And they started to come in and switch it from really the environment to climate change. Jim Hansen had done it in that same period, or I think it was 1988. He did a presentation to Congress. And in that, he predicted that the CO2 was going to destroy the planet for all practical purposes. Not true in any way. If we lose the CO2, we'll all die, we'll die from lack of plant food. But so it was that switch of the communists, the Marxists, into the environmental movement to try to turn it into this, what's going on now with AOC and all the other ones, the new Green Deal. It's not about climate. It's about getting control of the civilization. That's what it's about. It's big government taking over, making all the decisions, and it really has nothing to do with climate. It's a movement by the communists to take over the country. And that, I saw that maybe before some people because of my background, but that's what's going on right now. Now, if I can find, I do want to show one other one.
Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. It's not an easy job committing fraud on the scale which climate alarmists are, so I thought I'd give them some assistance. I've developed some new software which will give them a boost in identifying which critical data they should be hiding. But first, there's some important news out of Washington, D.C. They've identified a panel of experts who will be setting our nation's climate policy. Apparently, the Democrats felt they needed people who were better educated than AOC or Greta. Now let's review the problem which my software will help climate alarmists solve. This is the main page from the part of the National Climate Assessment which went out to journalists and policymakers. This page contains a lot of graphics. Here's one which shows heat waves increasing since 1960. Here's another one which shows Arctic sea ice declining since 1979. And another one which shows wildfires increasing since 1983. And one more which shows sea level rising since 1920. So we have one graph which starts in 1960, another which starts in 1979, another which starts in 1920, and one more which starts in 1983. When you want to mislead people with statistics, picking your start date is very important. First, let's look at the heat wave graph which starts in 1960. They carefully picked a period during the global cooling scare to start their graph so that they could show heat waves increasing over time. And here's the underlying data from the part of the National Climate Assessment which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. This graph is warm spells days, this one is heat wave magnitude, and this one is warmest temperature of the year. As you can see, summers were much hotter in the United States prior to 1960. So by hiding all the data before 1960, they were able to show a little bit of an upwards trend. I overlaid the part of the graph which went out to policymakers over here in this corner on top of the underlying data. You can see exactly what they did. The red bars are what policymakers saw, and the extreme heat prior to 1960 is what they didn't see. People may consider this sort of behavior to be shocking, but it's actually standard operating procedure for climate alarmists. This graph shows in pink all the data that was hidden from journalists and policymakers. This next graph is the one which shows wildfires increasing in the U.S. since 1983. And this graph of U.S. forest fires from the U.S. Forest Service is the one which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. And you can see why they hid all the data before 1983, because there was a lot more burn acreage in the United States prior to 1983. Burn acreage in the U.S. is down about 80% since the 1930s. It shouldn't be surprising to anyone because it was very hot and dry during the 1930s. Fires are associated with heat and drought, so there's very close correlation between heat waves and burn acreage. This next graphic overlays the graph which went out to journalists and policymakers over here on top of the data which didn't go out to journalists and policymakers. You can see the breathtaking fraud which is going on here. They carefully cherry-picked one year where they could show an increasing trend in wildfires, even though US wildfires are down 80%. And this graph shows in pink all the data that was hidden. Now let's look at the Arctic sea ice extent graph, which starts in 1979. Starting in 1979 makes it look like sea ice extent is decreasing linearly. And now let's look at the data which is being hidden. This graph is from the 1990 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. It shows Arctic sea ice extent all the way back to the early 1970s. And as you can see, extent was much lower prior to 1979. And 1979 was the peak. The data was taken from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And here's the accompanying text from the 1990 IPCC report. Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. The American Navy Joint Ice Centers produce weekly charts which have been digitized by NOAA. And down here is the key sentence. In 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less. So they hid the data before 1979 and tried to use the excuse that we didn't have satellite data prior to 1979. But the IPCC report said the exact opposite. Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. This shouldn't surprise anyone because we went to the moon in 1969. We actually have satellite data from earlier than that. This is from the February 1965 issue of National Geographic. It's a satellite photo of Arctic sea ice looking down on the North Pole. It's pretty clear why the National Climate Assessment is hiding all the pre-1979 data, because it would wreck their linear downwards trend line. Here's one more graphic showing US sea level rising over the past century, as if sea level around the US could somehow be different than it is in the rest of the world. So now let's look at what they're hiding. Sea level has been rising at the same rate for thousands of years. This graph from NOAA is made from data from the tide gauge in lower Manhattan. It shows that sea level has been rising at a steady rate since the middle of the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln, 2.84 millimeters per year. Teddy Roosevelt, 2.84 millimeters per year. Franklin Roosevelt, 2.84 millimeters per year. Jimmy Carter, 2.84 millimeters per year. And during Donald Trump's first term, it's also 2.84 millimeters per year. In other words, there's no indication that humans have had any impact on the rate of sea level rise. And if we go back even further, we can see that sea level has actually been rising for about 20,000 years. 20,000 years ago, sea level was about 120 meters or 400 feet lower than it is now. Anthropologists believe that during this time when sea level was very low, people were able to walk across from Siberia to North America, and that's how the first humans got here. From about 14,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago, sea level rose very quickly, but since then it's been quite slow. Climate alarmists want you to believe that this 400 feet of sea level rise is all natural, but somehow the last few inches were man-made. It's not easy work for climate alarmists to find the best point to start their phony graphs at, so I've developed some software to help them out. This graph shows the number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit in Waverly, Ohio for every year going back to 1895. You can see that there used to be a lot of 90-degree days at Waverly. Let me hover over this point. This is 1936. They had 82 90-degree days in 1936 in Waverly, Ohio. Now let's look at 1895. They had 73 days over 90 degrees in 1895. How about 1930? 1930 also had 73 days over 90 degrees. The year 1900 had 63 days over 90 degrees. So you can see that Waverly, Ohio had a lot of very hot summers prior to the year 1943, but since then summers have been much cooler there. And this diagonal downwards line shows the trend since the 1890s. The trend is about 26 fewer 90-degree days per century at Waverly, Ohio. My video this morning was about Iowa academics misrepresenting the trend in 90-degree days in Iowa. So the last thing which climate alarmists want the public to see is a downward trend in the number of hot days, which is actually occurring over most of the country. So in order to fool the public into believing that hot weather is increasing in the United States, they have to carefully cherry pick their start date. And my software will help them do that. Let me show you how. I'm going to drag the graph over to the left, and you're going to see the trend line change as I do. All right, here we go. I'm going to drag the graph, and you're going to see the trend line change dramatically. There we go. It's still going down, still going down, still going down. Whoa, now it's going up. That's exactly what climate alarmists want. So if you want to defraud the public about heat wave trends in Waverly, Ohio, the perfect start date is 1955. And the really cool thing is that with my software, you can do this with any kind of data, any kind of graph. Climate alarmists will be able to find the perfect cheating point for every single data set in the world. I'm open to suggestions what I should name this climate fraud tool, and I think I should charge them a lot of money for it. Going back to being serious, you might have noticed that I've been posting a lot of graphics recently. That's because the software enables me to find all kinds of interesting information which I wasn't aware of previously. I do intend to commercialize it at some point, but that's probably a few months off. So we can see that massive fraud is going on in climate science. Now let's look at some of the reasons why this is happening. Most climate scientists are just keeping their mouths closed because they have to. If they open their mouths, they lose their career, they lose their income, and they would be thoroughly trashed. But for some, it's the revolutionary mentality. This is an amazing email I got from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They said, achieving these greenhouse gas limits will require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. This is about overthrowing our government, our freedom, and our way of life. It's more difficult to convince adults of their lies, so they've co-opted children who are very innocent and don't know any better. They had millions of school children out of school today as part of their mass propaganda campaign. The Green New Deal reads like the Communist Manifesto. In 2010, one of the leading officials of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said, "We redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy." One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. That has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore. The New York Times wants people to panic because they know that panicked people are very easy to manipulate. And the Washington Post also wants people to panic, saying that the world's going to end in a little over 11 years. Same story is from the UN 30 years ago. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Climate alarmists want you to believe that this is a scientific thing, not a political one. In 2013, President Obama tweeted that 97% of the world's scientists agree that we're in a climate crisis. That same year, the American Meteorological Society took a survey of their professional members. They were asked, is global warming happening? If so, what is its cause? Look at the results for the top row. Yes, mostly human. 52% of respondents agreed with that, and only 37% of professional forecasters. So just over 1/2 of all professional members of the American Meteorological Society agreed that global warming was mostly man-made, and just over 1/3 of professional forecasters. They were not asked if global warming was dangerous or if we're in a crisis. They probably would have been laughed at had they asked such a ridiculous question. What we're seeing is an attempt to overthrow our government and way of life by some very unscrupulous people. They are willing to lie, cheat, and abuse children in order to achieve their political goals. The key thing which all the sane people need to do is to force the EPA into doing a reevaluation of the CO2 endangerment finding. That is the legal document which will allow climate alarmists to destroy our way of life. Tell your politicians and everyone you know that they need to demand that the EPA CO2 endangerment finding is revisited. That is the critical thing in getting the scam stopped. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on science and propaganda for a long time.
All right. Well, we don't really have too much more time, so maybe the thing we could do is, if you have any questions.
Well, we do have a real good question. We got 10 more minutes. By quarter two, we got to knock down and get out
Yeah,
of here.
yeah.
This is from our faraway friend that asked a question and hoping you can answer it. It's regarding the 5 largest publicly owned oil and gas companies spending $200 million a year lobbying and against Paris climate change, but to block binding climate-motivated policy. Basically, what they're doing is a recent example of BP is coordinating messages across social media and advertising platforms that reframe climate change as a dual energy challenge. On the one hand, oil and fossil fuel is saying we're going to do low carbon initiatives and stuff like that. Meanwhile, they're digging more wells and doing more fossil fuels. So could you talk about that sort of lobbying effort and?
Well, pretty much most of the people know, well, let me just start this way. If any of these people really believed that this was going to happen, that all this was going to happen, no one would be building houses in Florida and any place else on the coast, and everybody would be moving out, and you couldn't get insurance on a house near the coast any place, right? Because it's going to go underwater in a few years. So no one that's really knowledgeable believes any of this crap. So what they have to do, though, is they have to keep the government off their back. So they play both sides. They dig for the oil, they drill for the oil, and they give money to the people that are against them.
I was going to ask, do people know that at one time, about 10,000 years ago, Lake Erie and the Great Lakes were formed by
Glaciers.
They came back, the glaciers.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we might know it, but
Yeah, how about like that?
I don't think they teach anything in school anymore. They can't. I mean, we just didn't learn all this crap.
Let me get to Mark here, but one more quick question I want to get in before. Dr. Ball wrote and said that 2% variation in water vapor could account for all the carbon dioxide. Kind of
Yes.
interesting. That makes sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Well, just to add to this point, as far as playing both sides of the thing, if you ever get another Democratic president who does something like Obama, where he allocates money to this type of projects, they're not going to want to miss out on the opportunity to get their hands on free money. So playing both sides is, for a number of reasons, is what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think, as what Dave was saying, so much building homes and developments, the insurance companies are not going to insure. You're not going to get money for the loan because if it's going to get coastal flooding, they're not going to give you the money. But they are loaning that money, correct?
Yeah.
Obama just spent $15 million on a house on the Atlantic coast.
Yeah.
Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah.
Didn't he? Yeah.
Well, why would you go on any coast? Because the water level is all gonna go up at the same time. It's not gonna go up in one area and not in another.
The other thing with coastal flooding I heard was that the Florida is sinking. They pump water from Florida and the ground kind of goes down. So technically the ground is actually settling too.
Yes. A lot of places, they're pulling the groundwater out for drinking water. Louisiana, in fact, the problems they had with the hurricanes down to New Orleans was because of that. That whole area is sinking into the Gulf.
So even though they built the dikes and so forth in there, it's still lower than when the French came in and made the French quarters there. It's actually lower than back then.
Yes.
Well, the Delta too, I think it's sort of sinking. You know, when it goes out of the Gulf of Mexico, it's going down a little bit.
What causes all these hurricanes? Is it, why do they always say climate change?
Are they getting bigger and badder?
No. The amount of the intensity and the number of hurricanes has dropped significantly. Dropped. Extreme weather, that was one of the graphs that he showed that had those bands, and it was going down. That includes tornadoes, hurricanes, and all kinds of bad weather. And the number of them has dropped significantly.
And how about typhoons?
Yeah, they're basically the hurricanes. They just give them a different name over there. There's a little more warm water, and so I think they get a little higher intensity.
I was reading a lot more in this connection between water vapor and carbon. So carbon is like the light switch. More carbon, and the water vapor is like the amplifier. It amplifies any carbon dioxide. So the more our factories are pumping out carbon dioxide, it's like a switch, and it creates more water vapor, which somehow triggers the oceans to warm up, and I guess that produces more water vapor.
No. It's got nothing to do with the CO2.
Wow.
Nothing to do with the CO2.
CO2 is not triggering water vapor.
I was trying to find one of my charts, but the water in the atmosphere is about 2.5%. Okay, and water holds a lot of heat, more than pretty much all the gases and everything. CO2 is just under 420 part per million, which is 0.04%. Water is 2.5%. Water is the greenhouse gas that keeps us alive. If there was no water and all CO2, the temperature would be down. The light coming in from the sun is absorbed by the water. None of it is absorbed, very little of it is absorbed by CO2 because the water already grabbed it all. And the same thing is with the radiation, the infrared being radiated off the planet. The water is picking that up too, and the CO2 only has a really small part. You could run the CO2 up to 2,000 part per million, and it would maybe raise the temperature of the planet maybe 1 degree. And it's not that it transfers the heat to the water. The CO2 itself could be as hot as you want it to be, but there's such a little bit of it, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the water.
Right, as I understand, the water warms up and the water vapor rises, it condenses, turns into snow and rain, and then it comes back down to Earth, releasing it. So for a while, that in forming clouds up there, it's actually reflecting and cooling the planet. But how does that work as far as the heat and the water vapor going up, condensing?
Well, the water is going to be either water vapor or clouds, or it's rain and snow.
Right.
But depending on the level of the clouds in the atmosphere, some of the clouds reflect it off, but then lower clouds will actually bounce it back down again. So some clouds will hold the heat, other clouds will reflect it off. It's really complex. They have not been able to, let me say it this way. The amount of energy that comes in and gets bounced off is 30%. It's called the albedo of the planet. So 70% of the energy is absorbed by the planet, 30% is thrown off. Now, the bulk of that is clouds. So if the cloud levels go up, there'll be less coming in. And if the cloud levels go down, there'll be more coming in. Now, they don't have the ability, even with the supercomputers, to model that in their climate models. They can't even come close.
We'd be lucky they can forecast the next 5 days' weather.
Exactly.
Right.
So if you can't model the clouds, you can't forecast the temperature. It's not possible.
Yeah. As we wrap up, any other questions? Go ahead. Larry.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do they know what the temperature was, 5 million years ago or something like that?
Isotopes.
Digging down in the ground and then they sort of pull something out.
Well, the one thing they get, the CO2 they get pretty accurately from ice cores. And then the temperature they can tell by the kinds of plant fossils they find is one. And then the various isotopes within them. I don't know all the various,
Right, I mean, that's hard for me to believe, that how do you know? 850 million years ago, this is what it was. I just,
well, they look at rocks that are those old.
right.
And they look at the fossils, and they can determine by the fossils what kind of life there was. I've watched some of the stuff, I don't understand it.
Go
So,
back to Dr. Ball, we have notes on our Facebook page, there's a note thing, all of Dr. Ball's, and follow him on, he used to be a geologist, so he could,
Yeah.
make that more, yeah. Yeah, Bob.
Why is everybody worried about the temperature rising 1 or 2 degrees? Who cares? I mean,
well,
I'd rather have it warm than cold.
Right, it's more.
Well, if it warms up, the oceans get warmer, it melts the ice, the darn ice melts, it raises the coastal layer.
I have some graphs here, but the mean temperature of the planet is 17 degrees C.
What is that?
It's, well, it's, today the temperature in centigrade is 14.8 degrees centigrade, and the mean is 17. So we are below the mean temperature of the planet.
Like 70 or 80 degrees. I'm not running.
66.
Oh, I know.
So we gotta be knocking out cleaning
That's a
out.
rough, that's a rough, because you know the old formula is 9/5 of centigrade equals
So what does everybody think about having David for a half hour?
Thanks.
When we did that convention, I thought maybe blocking out 2.5 hours, maybe a 20-minute presentation, there'd be a lot of questions, and really just, if we don't get enough high school debates and activity with the high schools, I'd love to have speakers like David talk to the high schools, doing just like he's doing now, and